The connections that this scholar makes on Acts, Euripides the Bacchae, 1 Samuel in the Old Testament are remarkable. You're going to want to check this out for sure. Don't miss this episode. Also, consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. It helps me continue with the endeavors and getting these scholars to come join me on the program to educate the general public and teach as many people as possible. There's also one-time donations you can do to the PayPal down in the description. Love you guys. We are MythVision. You came to the right channel. You came to the right video. We're going to be talking about Paul or Saul. Lots of people have been trying to identify this character we call Paul. Is Paul someone else? Is he a Roman general? Is Paul Josephus? Is Paul Simon Magus? Is this, that? And a lot of people use the literary story and structure of Acts to kind of draw these conclusions because it's such a fictional narrative. It plays off of a fictional motif in many ways. What's history? What's myth? What's legend? What's real? And I want you guys to know that a lot of scholars for a long time have been trying to pin down this guy, Paul, and try to understand. Like recently I had an email someone sent me and they said, guys, Paul was prophesied, or Saul, I apologize, Shaul, S-H-A-U-L, I think the guy coming from a Hebrew background was saying he's been prophesied as this wicked guy who's supposed to come and this and that. I don't know if the guy was really actually named something like this and that this is just a literary motif. Well, today, you're going to really enjoy this show. And I tell you that because today, Michael Kochenash, am I saying that right? Kochenosh. Yes, Dr. Michael Kochenash. He's actually a student of Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald back in the day. Tell us a little bit about your education, if you don't mind. Give us your credentials, and then we'll start diving into Paul.
Sure. Yeah, I did my master's at Yale and then did a PhD at Claremont School of Theology with Dennis as my doctoral supervisor. And just a couple months ago, completed a 2-year postdoc at Hunan University in Changsha, China, working on early Christian literature and their use of literary models.
This is such a great article that you have. And is that made public, by the way, on your academia website?
Yeah, it was published in 2019 in the Journal of Biblical Literature, but they have an 18-month embargo period after which the author can post it anywhere for free open access. So it's on my academia page for anybody to read at their leisure.
Everybody really should. This was really fascinating because you take us into some of the scholarship and how they've been trying to answer a problem for quite some time. And you know, there's various views right here. Just to give you guys a example, Better Call Saul, Paul, I meant, the show. And I figure I'd just show you guys real quick. This is his actual article. You want to read it. It's only 17 pages. It's very, you put a lot of resources showing where you get your source material from. And let's start somewhere. Most scholars want to look for a biblical answer to a biblical idea. It just seems natural. They go to the Gospels. They're looking at Mimesis, which is something you're fond of, as well as Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. You guys are like really good with Mimesis. I really love this stuff. I know I keep saying really, but it's fascinating to see the connections. And most scholars are looking at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, to find a mimetic connection. There is a mimetic connection that you and other scholars have found with Saul, the king in the Old Testament, and the Saul of Paul in Acts. We're going to discuss the differences between Pauline letters a little bit, getting into Acts, talking about going with Saul, but there's a lot more going on here than just that. So I don't know where to begin. I'd like to see you maybe take us off.
Yeah, well, I guess we can kick it off by talking about the question of Paul. And a lot of people, even scholars, would assume that he not only went by the name Paul, but also by the name Saul. Right? He had two different names, and how they suss out when he used which names is a matter of debate. But the fact of the matter is, in his letters, both those that we are undisputably attribute to Paul and those that are disputed, He only calls himself Paul, so he never calls himself Saul. And in fact, the only New Testament source to call him Saul is the book of Acts. And there's a lot going on there too. So some of the ways that scholars in the past have tried to explain Saul and Paul as names is the appeal to Paul as a Roman citizen, right? And Roman citizens often had multiple names, some like a first name and a family name, but also a nickname sometimes. And so they say that Paulus is a Latin name, so they say that's probably his family name. And Saulus or Shaul, or it sounds like Paul or Paulas. And so it makes sense to say that was his nickname. Maybe he used that name in Jewish contexts and then used Paul in Gentile contexts. But there really isn't evidence in the New Testament to sustain those sorts of arguments. So, for instance, again, the book of Acts is the only source in the New Testament to call Paul Saul. And the book of Acts doesn't supply an explanation for the different names, and it doesn't cohere to those schemas like Paul, going by the name Saul in Jewish contexts. Right? Paul is in Jerusalem, and the book of Acts calls him Paul. In fact, the only real way you can make sense of the name distribution in the book of Acts is by the chronology of the book itself. And the dividing point is Acts chapter 13, where Paul begins his mission to before a Gentile audience. And the narrator, not Paul himself, the narrator says Saul, who is also called Paul, and then from then on always calls him Paul. And before that, he always called him Saul. With the exception of later in the book of Acts, where Paul is narrating events from his life that happened before the events of Acts chapter 13, he will refer to himself as Saul, or have people in his speech refer to him as Saul. And so that seems to be the dividing line. That's how the book of Acts uses Saul and Paul. But even that doesn't explain why call Paul Saul.
Right.
And in itself, it doesn't prove that the author of Acts was the first person to call Paul Saul. But I think there's enough of a literary connection you can make that explains why calling Paul Saul would be useful. That is probably most credible to say that the author of Acts, in fact, invented it, as best we can say.
So this is amazing what you're presenting, because we're going to go into some technical stuff and explain the literary connections, and maybe we won't get too technical. I think a lot of people could read your work and find it. It's free. Go down in the description, click the academia website link, and go check it out. It's 17 pages, guys. It'll take you 30 minutes at most.
Maybe more.
Maybe a little more, maybe 45
in some places, but
yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting because you point out a lot of the scholars that we're talking about in the 1800s, 1900s, like we're talking about a few centuries here that have been trying to explain this conundrum of Saul Paul. Mm-hmm. And some of them are trying to go the Roman route. Well, Roman citizens have multiple names, family names, surname, this, that. Mm-hmm. Another route of trying to explain it is that because the name Saul doesn't have a direct correlation to the Greek audience, or if you will, the Hellenized Greek language, that he just switched it to make Saul to Paul, as if it's just a literary change. But that's ignoring these mimetic literary motifs that you're going to draw on and show that the author is far more genius in the production of this manuscript, what we call, or if you will, this source Acts, the Apostles. He's drawn off multiple sources, and it's not just 1 Samuel. It's not just the Hebrew Bible, but we're also talking about the Bacchae. We will get to the Bacchae, but I think we'll handle dealing with King David and King Saul first. So tell us how's that work in Acts, and how's that work in the literary connection to the narrative in the Old Testament?
Yeah, so in the article, I ultimately suggest that the name Saul comes from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, King Saul, and that the attribution of the name Saul to Paul is an attempt to characterize him as a figure like King Saul. And this is not new, right? So at least as early as Augustine and Jerome, people are reading Acts and saying Saul, Paul, the Apostle Paul, Saul, it seems to be referring to King Saul in some way.
Right.
And so King Saul persecutes David, and Saul of Tarsus persecutes Jesus and Christians. And they say, well, the name change signals the new direction, the new identity of Paul from a persecutor to a proclaimer of Christianity. And that is, on the surface, very appealing. But the big critique of that, and it's a critique that I try to address in this article, is the name change doesn't happen at the point where Saul stops persecuting early Christians, right? So you have the Damascus Road experience where Paul is on the road to Damascus, and Jesus confronts him and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul is blinded. But then he stays in Damascus. He goes to Jerusalem, and the narrator continues to call him Saul. So that's in chapter 9 of Acts. And even at the beginning of chapter 13, so the narrative goes to Peter for a while and comes back to Saul. And it's only in chapter 13 where the narrative switches to calling him Paul. And so that's the question. But yeah, let's dig into the name Saul and talk about why it does make sense to associate Paul as Saul with King Saul.
Please do.
Yeah, so King Saul is only mentioned one time in the entire New Testament. And as it should happen, it's in the speech of Paul in Acts 13, the same chapter where his name in the narrative changes from Saul to Paul, in a different episode, but in the same chapter. And in Paul's speech, he talks about King Saul. He mentions some bare bones facts about him. So in telling the story about King Saul, Paul says, the Israelites asked God for a king. God gave them King Saul. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, which seems like a little extraneous, unessential fact that Paul relates. And then he says, Saul reigned for 40 years, and then God replaced him with David. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that, the notice about his tribal affiliation of the tribe of Benjamin, on the surface, doesn't seem like it's very significant, but readers of Paul's letters know that Paul is of the tribe of Benjamin. He says so in Romans chapter 1 and Philippians chapter 3. And so readers who have that competence can already associate there, if they haven't already in the narrative, associate Paul with King Saul. And in fact, there are even more reasons to do so. So Saul persecuted David over a number of chapters in 1 Samuel, 18 through 31, roughly. So this happens right after David slays Goliath. And then David starts to gain popularity and as taking military forces against the Philistines, and the Israelites proclaim, Saul has killed his thousands, but David is tens of thousands. And so according to 1 Samuel, there develops some jealousy from King Saul against David as a possible usurper to the throne. And so he starts persecuting him, pursuing after him. King Saul is seized with anger and chases after him. And even you get at one point, it's in, I think I wrote it down, but maybe I didn't.
It's in your article. I'm sure you're talking probably about the part where he literally calls to Saul and says, man, why are you pretty much saying, why are you persecuting? Why are you pursuing me? He says, why are you
pursuing after, which is the same verbal root as persecute. So Saul finally catches up with him once again, and they recognize each other. And David says, so it's in chapter 26, verse 18, why does my Lord persecute his servant? So Saul is persecuting David. And this is significant for our conversation, because there's something weird about what the book of Acts does. So Saul is introduced in Acts chapter 7, very briefly, and then again briefly in Acts chapter 8. But then in chapter 9, you get a more robust account of his persecution of the church. So Saul of Tarsus persecutes the church, imprisons men and women. He breathes fury of threats and murder. So it's all focused on the church. But then you have the road to Damascus encounter that we talked about, I mentioned earlier, where Jesus confronts Saul on the road to Damascus. And Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Which is a bit strange because he hasn't been. Jesus is not on the scene at all. He ascended in Acts chapter 1. But here he is saying that you're persecuting me. And so that can prompt readers of Acts to think about how the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts has characterized Jesus. And in fact, it's a recurring characterization that he is the son of David. Right. And even 2 verses, so I mentioned Paul talks about King Saul in Acts chapter 13. 2 verses after he talks about Saul, he talks about David and Jesus being the posterity of David. So linking Jesus with David there again. And so it seems to be that the book of Acts is characterizing Saul as a figure like King Saul, as a way to think about his persecution of the church, and using these this model, I'm forgetting the word I'm looking for, but so you have this model of Saul persecuting David, and here you have Saul of Tarsus persecuting the son of David. So it's a schema that is being used and projected onto the book of Acts as a way of making sense of what the narrative wants to accomplish. So readers who are familiar with King Saul's persecution of David can bring all that into their reading of the book of Acts, and it'll influence the way they think about Saul's persecution of the church, his persecution of David.
That's an interesting connection. When I saw that, I was like, okay, that makes perfect sense. We obviously see that, but there's more content in Acts. It doesn't stop there, and that's where it gets interesting. Many scholars have pointed out for a long time. I'll say this first before I continue with that. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and his mimetic work, which you were a student of, you see the criticisms. I'm sure you see the reluctance of them trying to face the problem that Dennis is rightly trying to point out on these literary mimetic connections between the Bacchae or other type of Homeric epics to the Gospels or Acts or different types of books, the Gospel of John, etc. And he's trying to, he isn't necessarily trying, he is presenting a clear connection between these books in a genetic way, unlike what you're seeing the predecessors who are trying to say, it's in the air, it's in the mist, and people, they go to the marketplace, they heard the story, this, that. Not saying that's not the case. Nobody's denying that. But for example, hearing Paul, it's hard when you kick against the goads, okay? Mm-hmm. This direct narrative, this statement comes directly from the Bacchae. Well, what do we do with that? We just gonna pick 1 or 2 things that we know directly connect to the Bacchae and go, well, that just found its way in? Or is there a literary motif, the same way there was a motif borrowing from King David and Saul to King David, the predecessor, Jesus of King David, and Paul? What's going on here with the Bacchae? Mm-hmm. And that is where there are connections. When you try to keep piecing to the Hebrew Bible, looking at the story in Samuel, you're not going to have the answers you're looking for in Acts for this type of thing, but you will find them in the Bacchae. And so maybe you can talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah. And I think that specifically talks to the question of what the book of Acts is doing with calling Paul Saul. And right, so appeals to 1 Samuel can't explain why Saul continues to be called Saul after the Damascus Road experience, right? So insofar as he is a King Saul figure, it doesn't really make much sense to continue calling him Saul. People like to think in the mode of the Hebrew Bible, and like Abram had an experience and his name was changed, and from then on, he was. So this is like that experience where he was changed, but his name doesn't change yet. And but that doesn't mean all of that isn't relevant. I just think we need an additional model. We need to read the book of Acts as referring to an additional model to help make sense of why the name change takes place later. Is there some sort of payoff to delaying the name change? And I think there is, and I think it's related to the Bacchae. So I think maybe the most interesting way of getting at the Bacchae in Acts would be to begin with something that Paul says. So Paul has a speech in Acts 22 where he's speaking in Jerusalem. He's speaking before an angry mob, so the narrative says. And at the beginning, so Acts 22, verse 3, he explains that he was educated at the feet of Gamaliel.
Yeah.
And so this is a part of his establishing his credentials. But the attentive reader of Acts will remember that Gamaliel is mentioned. He actually is a figure, is a character in the book of Acts earlier. So in Acts chapter 5, Peter and the apostles have been thrown in prison for preaching the gospel. And then an angel of the Lord releases them from prison. And the Sanhedrin is all upset about this. And so they convene as to what they want to do about Peter and the apostles, because after they were released from prison, they went right back to the preaching that they were supposed to not do anymore. And amid their discussions about what to do, Gamaliel speaks up and he says, listen, everybody, we need to be very careful about how we treat this. So if what their movement is not aligned with God's purposes, it's fine as far as we're concerned, because it'll fail no matter what. And he gives historical examples of Judas the Galilean and Theudas, who led rebellions against Rome and that were unsuccessful. And so he says that's evidence of that God was not behind those causes. They failed on their own. And he says, but conversely, if they are aligned with God's purpose and we oppose them, he says, you might find yourself to be a God fighter. So that's in 539. So theomakoi, fighting gods. So this is a very famous concept in antiquity. But this mention of Gamaliel in Acts 22 and Peter being Paul being a student of Gamaliel's, I think this is a bit ironic at the narrative level, because in Acts 9 you have Paul as Saul being a God fighter, and then in Acts 22 Paul reveals that he, as a young person, was a student of Gamaliel, who in Acts 5, before Saul was a God fighter, warned against God fighting. And so there's a bit of a tie-in there.
So it's practically, one can assume easily that this is most likely a fictional literary construct. In some respect, Gamaliel probably had zilch to do with the historical Paul. We don't have evidence of it.
We don't. Yeah, I think
we don't trust Acts for that kind of information.
It may be true. It may not be true. There's really, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And I like to focus on what you can gain literarily by looking at it.
Right.
And if there's evidence one way or the other, then you can talk about the historicity of it.
I didn't want to take you off the track, because what you're about to get at, I think, is important with the God fighter. Mm-hmm. This same Greek phrase, okay, it just, to me, I'm not so sure that would be on the lips of someone like Gamaliel in this type of narrative, because this is found in the Bacchae when Pentheus, and maybe you could tell us some of the characters for those who don't know the story of what is the Bacchae, what is Euripides the Bacchae, who is Dionysus, what is Pentheus. This is so powerful to me, and I think after reading your article, I really think you've solved the problem of centuries of scholars trying to wrestle with this issue. I think the Mimesis does give more insight and gives a better conclusion to the whole idea, this narrative that's going on in Acts. So the God fighter, Pentheus, is arguing with Dionysus. He's fighting against God. He's fighting against the gods. This exact phrase is found there. So maybe you can go into that. And
yeah, so God fighting theomachia is not uncommon in antiquity. It's not an uncommon idea or phrase, but it is paradigmatically associated with Pentheus, and especially as he's represented in the tragedy by Euripides called the Bacchae. And so that is the specific play that the book of Acts appears to quote by Paul in Acts 26, but we'll get to that. You already mentioned it.
Right.
So the play, I think probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with it, but we can go over some important points for our discussion anyway. So at the beginning of the Bacchae, Dionysus, the character, so this is a play, Dionysus comes out on stage alone, and he explains what is happening, what the play will be about, what his motivation is. So Dionysus is the god of wine, and so he's associated in mythology with drunkenness and debauchery and such things that would be associated with wine. And he says he's come to Thebes, which is a city in what is now Greece, from the east, from what is now Turkey. He says he's come here to take revenge. And the motivation goes back to his conception. So he explains that he was conceived, his mother Semele was impregnated by Zeus, which is a fact that will surprise nobody familiar with Greek mythology. Right? Zeus is knocking up everybody. And so Hera, Zeus's divine wife, Olympian wife, she's jealous, naturally, and comes to Semele in disguise and decides to trick her. And she says, you should ask Zeus to show you his true form. And Semele does this, and she asks Zeus, but Zeus is the god of thunder, right? And his true form, in this sense, is a lightning bolt, which then kills Semele. And Zeus protects Dionysus, fetus Dionysus, and brings him to gestation later on. But Semele's family takes this happenstance of Semele dying by a lightning bolt while claiming that Zeus had impregnated her as divine punishment. Right? The punishment fits the crime. You falsely claimed, they said, that Zeus impregnated you, and the divine retribution for that is death by lightning bolt. And so they disbelieve that Dionysus is the son of Zeus. And that is the core issue here, why Dionysus has come to take revenge on his family for disbelieving this claim of divine paternity. And so he comes to Thebes. His cousin is actually the king of Thebes, and his cousin is Pentheus. All right, they share a grandfather, Cadmus. Their mothers would be each other's aunts, but they don't. Dionysus comes to Thebes in disguise, so Pentheus doesn't know that it's Dionysus, his cousin. Dionysus is in disguise as a priest of his own worship cult. And so that's the main plot. Dionysus comes, he engages especially prominent women of the city in his Bacchic revelry. They go out to the mountainside and they have what appear from the outside to be drunken revelries, which makes Pentheus anxious. His mother and his aunts, among other prominent rich women in the city, are going out with this foreign person with foreign religious figure out into the woods. So he doesn't like it. He outlaws it, which we'll jump forward. There's a lot of interactions between the disguised Dionysus and Pentheus, but eventually the disguised Dionysus convinces Pentheus to go out and spy on their activity so he can know what's happening. And so they go, and he climbs up a tree to see their activities. But at that point, instead of just seeing them, he is seen by them. And Dionysus, with a disembodied voice, as if from the sky, you might say, calls on the women worshiping him to take revenge on this intruder. Pentheus is himself in disguise, and all the women are in kind of a Maenadic frenzy. So even his mother doesn't recognize him as her son. And they grab him, they take him, and they rip him apart. And so that's the climax. And then his mother even marches back into Thebes with her son's head on a spike. And then they are all punished again by Dionysus. So those are the main plot points that are relevant for what we're going to want to talk about with respect to Acts.
You mentioned the Jesus appears on the road to Damascus, light shining, and the same narrative is in the Bacchae, where he's going to spy on them in the woods. He's on the tree. Doesn't a light appear out of nowhere in that narrative?
It does, yeah. So immediately after he calls them to take revenge, it's kind of a weird phrase that it has, and it doesn't really. It's not something that stuck in my mind just from a casual reading of the Bacchae, but looking at the scene closely, it says something to the effect of like a pillar of fire went up into the sky, which obviously would create a flash of light. And so on the Damascus Road, so there are three iterations of the Damascus Road encounter. The first one in the book of Acts is recounted by the narrator. That's in Acts chapter 9. And then it's recounted twice by Paul himself in Acts 22 in the speech that I referred to. So immediately after talking about Gamaliel, he goes into talking about his Damascus Road experience. And then one more time in Acts chapter 26. And the details are not identical. Right. In some ways, they're even incompatible, but not in very important ways. But yeah, so in the first one, you do have, I don't remember the specifics. I think there is a bright light. Yeah. But the details that I'm not going to remember that are different is sometimes his companions hear the voice but don't see the light. Sometimes they see the light but don't hear the voice. Right. For our purposes, that's not really at issue. So in the first account, you have Saul. Yeah. So Saul. He is described in language that is reminiscent of Pentheus. So not distinctive, but it is similar. So he's breathing threats. He's plotting murder. He's pursuing after. He's persecuting the Christians, just like Pentheus is breathing threats and murder and persecuting Dionysus.
May I add that the Greek there is very, very similar, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So we have they're relatively common words, but given some of the other things, it is significant that they are sometimes the identical words, just conjugated for the different contexts. So there are a lot of verbal parallels in there. But then you have, so this is a common thing that will be repeated in every iteration, but I do want to go through them one by one. In Acts 9, with that context of Paul breathing threats and murder and pursuing after the Christians, you have Jesus confront him. And so we've already talked about how that sort of evokes the King Saul persecuting David paradigm. But there's also another paradigm, and it's the logic of Euripides' Bacchae. So in the Bacchae, you have Pentheus, who is persecuting, to his mind, adherents of a new religious movement, including the leader of the movement. But then he is confronted by the leader of that movement and then punished by the leader of that movement. So this is a paradigm that the book of Acts seems to, it at least echoes what the broad paradigm of the Bacchae. And then with each iteration in Acts 22 and Acts 26, it becomes more obvious that this is the paradigm, or at least a paradigm that the book of Acts is using. So in Acts 22, getting to what you were talking about with the light, you have that again in this iteration, but something that was missing from Acts 9 was the idea of vengeance. And so in Acts 22, Paul says he was intending to take vengeance on these Christians. Well, vengeance for what is not immediately obvious.
Right.
But then there was this bright light and this disembodied voice of Jesus saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And the result was that he was blinded, so he was punished by Jesus. And that matches, it's I call it a reconfiguration of the schema that happens in the Bacchae at that climactic point. So Pentheus is up in the tree spying on the Maenads, the Bacchants, the women. And then a disembodied voice of Dionysus calls out to the Bacchants, take revenge. And it's the same verbal root as Paul uses. And then there is, like we said, this bright light from the fire. And so that clues us in closer to very general parallels to more specific parallels.
If I may ask, in this particular context, it appears, it's strange to me about Christian martyrdom. Martyrdom is a heart issue, it seems, in this type of cult. I don't mean cult in a bad way, but we're talking about a new religion idea. Christianity seems to be new on the books, at least according to Paul. He's like, what is this thing? The way the narrative plays it, it's new. It's something new that they're not familiar with. Even though they say it was promised that these things would come, it's still something new that's appearing. What I find interesting is martyrdom plays a key role, especially in Acts. And what we have in this Pentheus Dionysus scenario is Dionysus is seeking revenge. He's punishing, I say Pentheus to save me a headache of trying to pronounce this, Pentheus.
I've heard it always.
Right. Pentheus, his cousin, he seeks revenge, and he uses these women to do that, and then punishes them at the end. So it's almost like he's using Paul for the purpose. And then in the end, what happens to Paul? Martyrdom. So it's like, I didn't know if that was a connection. It's just something that kind of dawned on me was there's a persecution narrative, if you will, playing a role in this as well.
Mm-hmm. Though Paul doesn't die in the book of Acts. He's not martyred in the book of Acts. Okay. I think the narrator knows of Paul's death, whether or not he conceives of it as a martyrdom. But Stephen is martyred in Acts chapter 7, I think.
But it may not be related to what I'm saying in the narrative of the Bacchae. That's why I was just trying to see if there was something there. But
I mean, it may be because the first mention of Saul as being a part of the persecution is at the end of Stephen being stoned to death. Right, Paul is there holding everybody's coats and nodding in approval of the stoning. So there's a possible connection, but not something that I've worked out in the way you're thinking.
I apologize, though, on steering you off the path. Let's get back on the way, the truth, and the life.
So there's one more iteration in the book of Acts, and we've already gestured toward it, and that's the final one in Acts 26. And in this one, it has a lot of the elements that we've already talked about in Acts 9 and Acts 22. But this is the one where we have the quote from the Bacchae. And some people say, you should not kick against the goads, and that this is sort of an ancient maxim. And it is. It becomes that because of the Bacchae. But because of the context in which it appears, I think it's more credible to situate it as a part of an imitation of the Bacchae. So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
In this account, Paul says he was exceedingly maddened, and the word for maddened, which occurs several times in the book of Acts, is one that is associated with Dionysian worship, and especially in the Bacchae. So it's like Mimesis. Where is it? I didn't write it down. But it's you can see the root of Maenadism in it, Mimesis. But that is the root. So he calls himself, like, I was exceedingly maddened, already sort of associating himself with Dionysus or the Dionysiac frenzy. And then in this account, so Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads. And the kicking against the goads is the quote from the Bacchae. So at one point in the Bacchae, before the climactic scene where he goes up in the tree and then is dismembered, Dionysus, he is in disguise, but he is still Dionysus, says to Pentheus, I would sacrifice to him rather than rage on, kicking against the goads a man at war with God. So he warns him, like, you're going down the wrong path. This is not going to work out well for you. So he warns him. But what does Pentheus do? So we know. So and we'll come back to that. So he's putting onto Jesus this warning that Dionysus gives to Pentheus. You should not do this. Stop fighting against this god. And what happens is Saul, he's not blinded in this account. I'm forgetting. I've lost my track. In any case, after he explains this story to Festus, King Festus, Festus calls Paul mad, again, so mine, twice. And then Paul says, I am not mad, mine, but I'm sophrosune, which is of sober mind, which is contrasting with Dionysus. But this is key because it answers, I think it gives us a way to think about why his name doesn't change. So his name continues to be Saul after this experience because it allows, I won't say because, I'll say by leaving him still Saul, it allows readers to contrast what Saul does with what Pentheus does. So Pentheus's immediate response to Dionysus, so I'll reread it. Dionysus says, I would sacrifice to him rather than rage on, kicking against the goads, a man at war with God. Pentheus says, yes, I'll sacrifice, but it'll be the women's slaughter, right? So so he's not going to stop persecuting Dionysus. In fact, he will murder all of his adherents. So he's warned against God fighting, but he continues to do it unchecked.
That's
what's that?
Dr. McDonald brings that stuff up because he's
absolutely
he's talking about this, how they're using these narratives and they change it on purpose to make it better.
Mm-hmm. To make it better. I think the way I think of it is communicating something in a meaningful way. So if you want to make Paul look good, you could do it by characterizing him in a way that evokes this ancient model, and then his actions can demonstrate his superiority. And so in this case, that is what I think is happening. Mm-hmm. So whereas Pentheus disregards the divine advice and continues and results in his own death, his own very tragic death, Saul instead, he goes and stays with the disciples in Damascus and in Jerusalem. He's continued to be called Saul. And the people in both Jerusalem and Damascus fear him. Like, he still has his reputation as a God fighter, as a persecutor of the church. But he goes into synagogues and proclaims Jesus as the Son of God, which is really what Dionysus wanted Pentheus to do, right? The whole play is about Pentheus and his family's refusal to acknowledge Dionysus as the son of Zeus. And so specifically, the book of Acts says Saul was proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God. When you read it through the framework of the Bacchae, it seems very clear that this is supposed to be rivaling Pentheus. So
that's what I mean.
Whereas Pentheus was warned, but then and suffered the consequences, Saul is warned and takes heed of the warning and reforms. So he is punished in two of the accounts with blindness, but it's only for a time. And then he goes on. And then later in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 13, when he has his first audience with a Gentile audience, so he proclaims the message to Sergius Paulus, that is when he starts to be called Paul, which aligns with our understanding of Paul from his letters, right? So Paul in his letters calls himself the apostle to the Gentiles. And so it makes sense that it's in this scene where he begins a Gentile mission that he gets the name Paul that readers would have been familiar with prior to reading Acts. Yeah,
that really is interesting, seeing how they pull off motifs and change the motif. And when I said making it better is like what the reader would have expected in the Bacchae, or wanted to see Pentheus do instead of getting killed and going through this horror, it would have been a better story. I noticed that the Christian authors like a merciful and a good, they're more optimistic on the outcomes. They like the idea that when Jesus calms the storms instead of maybe the gods ignoring and not being merciful, or Jesus shows mercy, whereas the other gods that are borrowed in what Dennis does is show, they weren't so merciful. And I like the Greek epics for this very reason, that it's like a great movie that's like, oh, dude, what? He took his head off. In the Christian story is like, let's make this soft. Let's make this gentle, because
sometimes, right? So in this case, I think you're right. Like, you can imagine the audience at the Athenian theater, which is named after Dionysus, watching the Bacchae, and you can see that scene where Dionysus gives the warning. And you can imagine the audience, if they're at all sympathetic and not wanting it to be a tragedy, saying, just say it, acknowledge his divine parentage, and everything will be fine. You'll avert all kinds of trouble. But he does not. But there is Christian literature that is not so forgiving and not so. So especially, I'm thinking of, I think it's the Apocalypse of Peter, which is an apocryphal work, where have a tour of hell, and everybody is in there is punished with appropriate punishments, which fits in with Greco-Roman stories that are similar to it.
Well, if I may, Michael, I think this is important. I'm not saying that it doesn't carry the same potential of the horrid epic finality, but they played the narrative that Paul did submit. So if Paul didn't, let's just say, because they are drawing off that motif, you can expect a horrific ending for this guy, but they did it on purpose, I think, on showing, hey, we're borrowing this motif to give it more of a, he obeyed, and look what happens when you obey, everybody. Look, be like Paul, listen and believe in Jesus, believe in the Son of God. You know what I'm saying?
And you have negative examples in the book of Acts too. So Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead for lying. You have Herod Agrippa in Acts 12, who is given divine accolades and does not immediately renounce them, and is struck by an angel of the Lord and consumed by worms. So you do have people who are punished very severely, and you have people who are punished less severely, like Saul is punished with blindness. Bar Jesus in Acts 13, the Jewish false prophet, the narrative calls him, he's punished with blindness just like Saul is. So you have gradations, but yeah, I think it's playing with the audience's familiarity with these earlier stories, these paradigmatic stories, and the way it plays with expectations and perhaps hopes of how things might work out.
Earlier stories. I love that. I mean, I can't even get past that part with a Christian apologist because they're so defensive. And it's like, look, man, you want to believe, that's fine. I have my family, most of my family are Christian, but if I'm going to be honest and factual about some stuff, like, there's good reason not to die on hills that to me are just absurd. There's no point in, I think they think that somehow destroys the validity of their perfect, infallible, inerrant perception of the text, and not recognizing its genre and what kind of books these are. And you want to believe, that's fine. But I just say that to say, like, the scholars across the board will recognize, yeah, it's an older story, but it's being used in the theme of this. So this begs the question, and I have to ask this. Did you want to comment on that before I ask you a question?
Oh, no. I was just going to chime in. There are a lot of different ways of taking the text seriously. And oftentimes taking it literally is not the most serious way of taking it.
Right. So. This is my question.
Mm-hmm.
In light of this being obviously utilized in the narrative, Dr. McDonald has brought this to my attention, the same thing with Jesus. They're pulling from narratives, doesn't negate the historicity of the character. It doesn't negate Jesus didn't exist, that you're borrowing from these other mythologies. At the same time, does this lead... it takes away the credibility of this being historically accurate in any real sense. It's difficult. I don't think we can strain out the mythology and be able to cipher what is truly historical in this account. But let me get your own subjective opinion, because it's all based on, like, I guess here, because there's no evidence. You know what I mean? Like, you can't say, I know. So this is personal. This is just your own assumption. Do you think that there was a guy named Paul who, let's just say he was probably more along the lines of the faction of the James sect initially, potentially? Maybe he was along the faction of some type of Pharisee type sect that was like, dude, we're not jumping into this cult about a Messiah figure who's somewhat semi-divine, potentially, who knows? We're not following this view of Jesus. This is a fringe Jewish sect. I'm not falling in line with this. I'm sticking to my Pharisaic view, which kind of places Paul, previous to becoming a Christian, within a Pharisee school type of thinking. Mm-hmm. And then he ends up having a conversion of some sort that gets mythologized in Acts later, but in the Pauline corpus, he legitimately has some subjective experience, and he says, look, I'm definitely going to now believe in this. He may have seen stuff in the scriptures. He may have had a subjective, whatever type of experience, something happened, but now he believes in Jesus. Mm-hmm. Do you think that is probably one of the more accurate portrayals in your own guess on this?
Do I think the book of Acts portrayal of it is accurate?
I'm talking about in general on Paul. I mean, was Paul previously some Jew who said heck no to Christianity, or do you think his persecuting of Christians or anything adamantly coming to Christianity was a true thing at all?
We have sources. We have Paul's letters. We have the book of Acts. They're sometimes consistent, sometimes inconsistent. As historians, I think the best you can do is talk about what is being claimed as opposed to what actually happened. Mm-hmm. And so Paul does... I think Paul was a real person, and I think there's no reason to doubt his claims that he was a Pharisee, that he did persecute Jesus followers in some way, whatever he thinks he means by that. I think that's probably true, and he did have, he does claim to have had some kind of experience that changed his mind. I think it's good to be careful about talking about Christianity and Judaism as if they're two separate things. Mm-hmm. Certainly in the first century, that's not helpful, I think. Better to think of different sects. So like Phariseeism and Sadduceeism and Christ followers, they're all within Judaism. And so it's not Paul converting to a different religion. It's Paul changing his mind within Judaism.
Right.
And affirming Jesus as the Messiah in some sense. I think that happened. Subjectively, I'm inclined to think that did happen.
Right. That was my question. Some guys who watch my channel don't even think Paul existed at all.
Right. I'm aware of that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's not something I've really delved into as a scholar, like the actual. I don't see reason to think that is the case. I think there's no reason to doubt that somebody named Paul existed, and he probably wrote some letters.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, actually, at this point. I'm not closed off to ideas as they come forward, but I always tell people, like, there's guys who want to say all the Pauline epistles, all of them are fiction. And I'm like, I don't know who would want to write a fiction of 1 Corinthians 9. Paul and Barnabas are arguing about the other apostles being able to get paid, and they're getting donations, they're getting something for their labors, and is it just me and Barnabas? He sounds like an upset person. Like, that's it. To me, that's criteria of embarrassment, because he's like, and I'm not saying I need money, but I'm saying, like, it's just not right. All the other guys get to do this and we don't, and it's written, that does you should not muzzle the oxen, and like it just sounds like upset man.
What benefit could you have for inventing that?
I don't see any fictional narrative why that matters to create that, like to invent that. I see that as like atypical of a person in real life who's upset about something, who's writing to the church that's probably not wanting to give any more money to him so that he can give it to the church or whatever. I don't know. I'm just guessing here, but it doesn't sound like that. Like Acts, you can see motive. You can see why they're doing it. It's a story. It's not history in the real sense. Is there history there? What do you think? Is there history there?
Probably, yeah. I think you can talk about things that correspond with other sources. And there could be history in places where we can't even determine if it's history, right? So we don't have sources to independently attest to every single thing that actually happened in the book of Acts, as opposed to what is fictionalized or novelized. So surely some is, and we have the Jerusalem Council seems to correspond with something that Paul talks about, the conflict with Peter and in Galatians. So there are things that happened for sure, I think, or at least we can claim as historians that there's reason to think that they reflect historical events.
Dr. Michael Kochenash, ladies and gentlemen, go in the description, get the link and check out his article. If you know Greek, you'll be able to read the words. I don't.
Everything's translated.
There's a couple, like, you've left phrases in there, though, so they could see, like, oh, that word is used there. That's words used here. And I really do appreciate that. I enjoyed that. Better Call Saul.
Call Paul Saul, yeah.
Yeah. You better call Paul Saul. That was such a catchy little title in light of that show. I really did enjoy that show. But I want everybody to go down there, check it out, give him some attention, if you will. He is a student of Dr. Dennis R. McDonald, and he is continuing to pursue more information on this. One day, who knows, you might be doing all sorts of amazing stuff. But I hope to have you join me again, and maybe we can have you and Dr. McDonald at some point join on the show together, hang out, and have a awesome conversation, because a lot of people enjoy what Dr. McDonald is bringing to the table, which, in effect, you're bringing to the table. So I really do appreciate that, brother.
No, thank you very much.
Is there anything you'd like to say to the public before we go?
Nothing that comes to mind, but thank you.
Absolutely. So don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that we are MythVision.